At 0310, on the morning of April 18, 1942, a Japanese fisherman turned lookout aboard the converted trawler Nitto Maru saw masts on the horizon where there should have been only sea. 6 hours earlier than in our timeline, before the sun had risen high enough to wash out the silhouettes, the watch caught the faint geometry of warship superstructure against a sky still dark in the west. The clearer horizon that morning, combined with a watch rotation that placed an experienced fisherman at the glass, gave the Empire a margin of warning it had no right to expect. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The contact report flashed by radio to the Yokosuka Naval District before USS Nashville's 5-inch guns reduced Nitto Maru to splinters and oil. Captain Mark Mitscher, on the bridge of USS Hornet, understood at once what the transmission meant. The carrier was still some 650 nautical miles from Honshu, far beyond the planned launch point of 400. Vice Admiral William Halsey, aboard USS Enterprise, faced a choice he had not expected to face for hours yet. He could turn east and abandon the strike, or launch 16 overloaded B-25 Mitchells into a sky the Japanese now knew to watch. He chose to launch. What no one on either flight deck understood that morning was that the contact report had already been read, decoded, and acted upon, and the killing trap was airborne before the first American bomber cleared the deck. The B-25s climbed slowly, fuel-heavy and laboring, trading altitude for the dim hope of reaching China. Doolittle's lead aircraft cleared Hornet's bow at 8:20 and turned west under a low overcast. Behind him, 15 more bombers staggered into the air across the next hour. The men inside them had trained at Eglin Field through the winter, had practiced short deck takeoffs until the technique was muscle memory, had volunteered for a mission whose destination was withheld until they were already at sea. They flew now into a sky that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had been preparing since before dawn. Kaga, refitting in home waters after the Indian Ocean raid, had her zeros aloft by 9:40. The first interception came roughly 200 miles east of the Boso Peninsula, where a flight of 9 A6M2s descended on Doolittle's lead element from the sun. The B-25, designed as a medium bomber and stripped of its belly turret to save weight, had no answer for fighters in trail. Doolittle's aircraft took cannon fire across the cockpit and the port engine within the first pass. It spiraled into the Pacific without survivors. Over the next 90 minutes, in successive waves, the Zeros worked their way through the strung-out American formation. Some bombers jettisoned ordnance and tried to climb into cloud. Others flew on toward Japan and were destroyed within sight of the coast. 15 of the 16 aircraft were shot down. 8 crewmen drowned at sea. 7 were pulled from rafts and rubber boats by Japanese destroyers and patrol craft, bound and taken to Tokyo. Imperial General Headquarters had told the Japanese people in print and over the radio that the home islands could not be bombed. The captured airmen were the proof and the prize. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's cabinet moved quickly, and within 3 weeks the 7 survivors were arraigned before a military tribunal in a Tokyo courtroom whose proceedings were filmed for newsreel release. The men were charged with indiscriminate bombing of civilians, though their bombs had never been released. Confessions were extracted, translated, and broadcast. The verdicts were uniform and the sentences identical. The executions were carried out at the Yoyogi Parade Ground in early May, before cameras and a curated crowd. Footage moved through neutral capitals within days. In Buenos Aires, in Bern, in Lisbon, the images of bound American officers reached front pages before the United States War Department had finished notifying next of kin. The propaganda effect inside Japan was electric. The propaganda effect inside the United States was something else entirely, something the Roosevelt administration had not war-gamed and could not contain. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana had opposed intervention in Europe before Pearl Harbor and had grown quieter, though not silent, in the months that followed. The Doolittle footage gave him a platform he had not enjoyed since 1941. On May 19th, he introduced a non-binding resolution in the Senate calling on the administration to explore, through neutral intermediaries, a negotiated armistice in the Pacific while prosecuting the war against Germany to its conclusion. He framed the measure as prudence, not surrender. He was not alone. The resolution failed by 7 votes. But the margin was the story. Newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco printed the roll call. Gallup polling in early June showed 41% of Americans favored exploring terms with Tokyo. The administration's war coalition, knit together after Pearl Harbor by shared shock, had split along a fault line the executions had pried open. And the consequences of that fracture would prove more damaging to American strategy than any battle yet fought. Hornet had taken bomb damage during the Japanese air pursuit of Halsey's withdrawing task force and limped back to Pearl Harbor under tow for the final 200 miles. Enterprise required boiler repairs that would keep her in dry dock through mid-June. Admiral Chester Nimitz, surveying his carrier strength in late May, found himself with Yorktown alone and no margin for the kind of ambush that had been planned at Point Luck. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, reading the intercept and the captured airmen as confirmation that fortune favored decisive action, nonetheless chose to wait. He postponed the Midway operation into July to incorporate Zuikaku's air group, repaired and reconstituted after Coral Sea, which itself had unfolded as a more cautious affair with American carriers held back. By the time Yamamoto sailed, the strategic moment had shifted. Midway fell on July 14, 1942, after a brief and one-sided engagement. The combined fleet now ranged east of the date line, and the Central Pacific belonged to the Empire. In late August, the Tojo government opened a back channel through the Swiss legation in Tokyo. The terms were precise and deliberately public-friendly. Japan would freeze its current military line, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, in exchange for an end to American unrestricted submarine warfare and a mutual non-aggression understanding for the duration of the European War. There was no demand for territorial concession from the United States. There was no mention of China. Roosevelt rejected the proposal within 72 hours of its arrival in Washington. He could not, however, prevent its publication. A sympathetic Swedish newspaper carried the terms on September 3rd, and the wire services moved the text worldwide by nightfall. In the United States, the proposal was read by men and women who had buried sons in the Philippines and on Bataan, and who now read that those losses might be the price of nothing further. The administration held the line on rejection, but the line was visibly held, not assumed. Roosevelt and General George Marshall responded by tightening, not loosening, the Europe First strategy that had been agreed at the Arcadia Conference. The North African landings, originally planned for November, were accelerated. Resources earmarked for Pacific carrier construction were quietly redirected to Atlantic escort production. Admiral Ernest King, who had championed the Doolittle Raid and pressed for an aggressive Pacific posture from the war's first weeks, protested in writing and was overruled in person. Guadalcanal, which Marines had landed on in August, became a bleeding stalemate through the autumn. By February 1943, with the Japanese reinforcing through the slot and American reinforcement throttled by shipping priorities elsewhere, the island was abandoned. The withdrawal was conducted in good order. It was also televised, in a sense, through the photography of the war correspondents who flew out with the last battalions. The image of Marines boarding transports as a Japanese flag rose over Henderson Field would do almost as much political damage as the Doolittle executions had done 8 months earlier, and then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Germany's surrender in May 1945 freed the men, the steel, and the shipping that the Pacific had been denied for 3 years. By every measure of industrial output, the United States now possessed the means to retake everything Tokyo had won. The political memory of the Doolittle Massacre, of the Wheeler Resolution, of Guadalcanal abandoned, and the Bern terms refused but never forgotten, made a full island-hopping campaign something no peacetime Congress would authorize. A ceasefire was negotiated in Manila in the spring of 1946, brokered through the same Swiss channel that had carried the original proposal. Japanese forces remained in place across much of Southeast Asia. The Philippines were returned to Commonwealth status under a complicated condominium. Indochina, Malaya, and the Indies stayed within the co-prosperity sphere in all but name. The cold Pacific that followed was not the Cold War the world remembers. It was quieter, more ambiguous, and longer. Tokyo and Washington maintained embassies and traded grievances through diplomatic notes for 40 years. China denied the Allied victory it had bled for, fell into a civil war whose outcome the United States no longer had the political will to influence. The men executed at Yoyogi were remembered each April in small ceremonies in their hometowns. The carriers Doolittle had launched from were broken up for scrap in the 1950s, their war records ending with the raid that defined them. History, in this timeline, did not record a triumph. It recorded a cost and a question, and the long silence in which both were carried.